The desk lamp cast a narrow pool of light over the workspace. Kidow sat perched on the far edge, his body perfectly still, eyes fixed on the glowing monitor. The owner sat hunched forward, fingers flying across the keys in a steady, rhythmic clatter. Above the screen, the small green light of the webcam blinked in the darkness, a steady pulse that caught Kidow's attention. He shifted his weight, claws pricking into the wood of the desk. On the screen, a white arrow darted across the digital landscape, stopping and starting with the owner's frantic movements. Kidow lowered his head, tracking the path of the cursor with intense focus. He reached out a single paw, testing the air, then extended his claws just enough to make contact. He tapped the spacebar once with intent. The browser window snapped shut, vanishing into the taskbar below. The screen went blank. The owner paused, fingers hovering mid-air, and stared at the empty desktop. He turned his head, looking toward the edge of the desk where Kidow sat, perfectly motionless, waiting for the next movement. The owner sighed, his hand moving to the mouse to reopen the application. He clicked once, twice, and the browser snapped back into view. He began to type, his focus returning to the work. Kidow did not wait for an invitation. With a sudden, fluid spring, he launched himself from the desk edge and landed squarely in the center of the keyboard. The impact forced a chorus of clicks as his weight pressed dozens of keys at once. On the monitor, lines of gibberish flooded the document, a cascade of random letters and symbols. The owner stopped typing. He stared at the screen, then down at the keyboard where Kidow sat, unbothered, kneading his paws into the plastic keys. The owner exhaled, a long, sharp sound of frustration. He reached out, gripped Kidow under the midsection, and lifted him into the air. Kidow dangled for a second, his claws catching briefly on the edge of the keyboard before he was deposited onto the floor. The owner wiped the screen clean, his movements brisk and deliberate, desperate to regain control of the workspace. Kidow hit the floor with a soft thud. He stood there for a moment, head tilted, watching the owner's back. He was not finished. Kidow remained on the floor for 5 seconds. He stared at the owner, whose fingers had just begun to strike the keys again. Then, with a silent, calculated leap, he was back on the desk. He did not aim for the keyboard this time. Instead, he strutted toward the center of the workspace, his tail held high, moving with the arrogance of a predator in his own territory. He stepped directly onto the row of function keys. The laptop screen flickered violently. A window popped up, and the familiar blue icon of a conference call began to pulse. The owner did not see it yet, his eyes fixed on the document he was trying to salvage. A chime rang out, crisp and professional, cutting through the silence of the room. The screen transitioned. A grid of small faces appeared, all waiting for a response. The owner froze, his breath catching in his throat as the reality of the situation hit him. He reached out to slam the lid, but he was a second too late. The camera light turned solid, indicating the feed was live. The room was no longer private. The meeting had begun, and Kidow stood squarely in the middle of the workspace, tail twitching, ready for the next move. The lens caught the light, but only for a moment. Kidow stepped forward, his body blocking the view entirely. A wall of orange fur filled the frame, effectively silencing the broadcast. Across the grid of faces on the monitor, the participants stopped talking at once. One person leaned closer to the screen, squinting in confusion. Kidow ignored the silence. He shifted his weight, his eyes locked on the moving images trapped behind the glass. He swiped a paw at the monitor, his claws clicking rhythmically against the surface as he tried to pin down the shifting expressions of the colleagues. The owner lunged, fingers grabbing for Kidow, but the cat dug his claws into the desk mat, anchoring himself firmly against the intrusion. Kidow pivoted, his head snapping toward a flickering cursor near the bottom of the screen. He lunged, mouth open, and caught the digital pointer between his teeth. The screen shuddered under the sudden contact. The owner pushed again, harder this time. But Kidow only arched his back and batted at the faces on the monitor with renewed intensity. The meeting was a blur of voices and movement, none of it mattering as the struggle for the workspace reached its absolute peak. The owner slammed the laptop lid shut, cutting the feed and the noise in one sharp motion. Silence returned to the room. Kidow did not retreat. He settled directly onto the closed lid, shifting his weight until he found a comfortable position. A low, rhythmic purr vibrated through the metal casing beneath him. He began to lick his paw with slow, deliberate strokes, entirely unbothered by the sudden end of the broadcast. The owner leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling and exhaling a long, weary breath. Kidow tapped the lid with his tail, a steady, rhythmic thud that echoed against the desk. He waited for the screen to wake, but when it remained dark, he stood up and stretched his legs. The owner pushed his chair back, scraped it across the floor, and retreated into the kitchen. Kidow hopped down from the desk and followed, his eyes fixed on the owner. He leapt onto the kitchen table and knocked a pen onto the floor with a flick of his nose. He stared at the owner, waiting for a reaction. The owner picked up the pen, sighed, and turned away. Kidow did not hesitate. He sprinted back toward the desk, jumped onto the keyboard, and felt the familiar plastic keys beneath his paws. The cycle had already begun again.